Horizon Gents. Now this I'm gonna post on my main channel CG Reaction, but also my new history channel that I created. If you don't know that one, check out the link in the description, go there and subscribe, because once that channel gets big enough, I'll just stop posting history videos on CG Reaction. I'm gonna post solely on that one. Algorithm doesn't like watch many different type of videos, so I just decided to make history reaction channel completely different. So check that out. This is, why didn't the US focus on Japan first in World War II? What you mean, as soon as World War II kicked on? Is that what it is? Why would they? Isn't that like, yeah, Germany is the one who invaded Poland, and then slowly Americans got into the European theater, right? I don't know what this video is going to be about, if it's about that or later on. But it's going to be interesting. Let's do this one.
When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, it wasn't too surprising that the US would fight back. And when the Germans and the Italians, in an act of near unbelievable silliness, also declared war on the US, they were obviously going to have to fight them too. But in spite of the fact that Berlin and Rome hadn't actually attacked them, the Americans opted to focus their attention on them first, in what's called the Europe First strategy. But given the shock and damage that the Japanese caused on December the 7th and the immense public fury that followed, why didn't the United States focus its...
Whoa! So after Pearl Harbor, US didn't attack Japan. They focused on Europe first. The fuck? I didn't know that. That is insane. How does that even work? Like, people are pissed off. This, like, after 9/11, they probably waited few years to invade Iraq or something. That equivalent. Much worse than that, probably. Okay, Pearl Harbor was bombed. People are pissed off in America, and they're not going after Japan. They're going after Europe first. How do you sell that to your people?
energies on defeating Japan and avenging Pearl Harbor? Why did the US choose to finish Italy and Germany off first? So as you'll all know, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a shock to the American people. It near instantaneously reversed the anti-war isolationist attitudes and replaced them with a Japan's population is much too high one. And it won't shock you to learn that the American people, politicians and especially military all wanted revenge. President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war, which passed unanimously, providing you ignore the one congresswoman who voted against it. With this done, the US was free to focus its incredible power and resources.
One woman. I already see everybody like looking at who let her in.
On the country that had wronged it. But before this could begin, the Germans and Italians declared war on the United States. Now, whilst the US was obviously free to ignore Italy, the problem was now that Germany was able to sink US shipping to and from Europe. And boy did it. This meant that the US Navy now had a battle to win in the Atlantic alongside the one in the Pacific, which obviously meant that resources would have to be divided between the two. Now, it wasn't a secret that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was sympathetic to the Allied cause, and had wanted to help Britain as much as he could get away with. Much of this was because he saw the Germans as the greatest long-term threat to the United States, and he believed that if they were allowed to dominate the European continent, it wouldn't be long until Berlin would start interfering in the Americas, and thus could potentially pose a threat to the American mainland, especially if it had help from Japan. With America now in the war fully, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was quick to travel to Washington to work out a strategy for the war. The first thing they agreed to do was create a unified command structure and share important technology, something that the Axis didn't feel the need to do, but I'm sure that will work out fine. Now, the big sticking point was which theatre would be prioritised by the Americans during the war. Obviously, the British were very focused on the Germans, because they were an existential threat to the home islands, and Churchill found an ally in most of the US Army. For the Army, the fight against Germany was obviously going to be a land-focused campaign which would allow them to do the most work. Whereas against Japan, there wasn't as much scope for large-scale land-based warfare, and many in the Army worried that they would be second to the Navy, because inter-service rivalry was also a thing in the US. However, it was nothing compared to the absolute hate fest that...
You fucking telling me that because of Army versus Navy mentality, they're like, yeah, we can do more things in Europe, well, Navy will take over Japan thing, so we're gonna... Where that fucking comes... Ask any historian, like, okay, ask anybody who's like, who know history, but doesn't know about this, and why did they decide to attack Europe? None of them will tell you, oh, it's because of Army versus Navy mentality. The fuck?
That was the Japanese Army and Japanese Navy's relationship. Obviously, most of the US Navy wanted their Japanese counterparts to get an all-expenses-paid trip to the seafloor, and so just wanted to hold off the Germans in the Atlantic whilst they did this. Now, this meeting between the British and the Americans only came about a few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and so emotions were still running high. Churchill, though, was able to get most of what he wanted at this meeting by convincing the Americans of a few things. He argued that unlike Japan, Germany was an existential threat to Moscow and London, and that there was no way of knowing how long the USSR could hold out against the ongoing German invasion. and that if the US didn't focus on clearing the Atlantic and then sending supplies to the Soviet Union, then it could potentially lose fairly soon. If that were to happen, then the Germans would then be free to turn their full attention to the British, and Churchill wasn't able to guarantee that Britain would be able to resist such an onslaught. And if Britain fell, or at least made peace, then there would be no way of dislodging the Germans from the continent.
I mean, he wasn't really wrong. He wasn't bullshitting. That is kind of true. If Nazis would not stop at the time they were stopped, they had certain ideas. There are things at play. And yeah, if everything fell and Britain fell, yeah, it was like they were already like planning to go like towards like Asia, like China and India, and like yeah, they would have eventually tried to attack USA. They were already attacking the boats, so he wasn't really wrong there. I mean, yeah, Germany came in. Germany had like fuel and resource crisis. With time, they would have resolved that, like looted from somewhere else. So it's kind of like good in a hindsight if you think about it. Like, yeah, it's better that they did it this way. If they had attacked Japan first and let Germany go, who knows what would happen?
Thereby presenting a much greater long-term threat to the US. Whereas, if the US focused on Germany immediately, then it would be able to guarantee that Britain and the Soviet Union would keep fighting. And then, once the three of them had defeated Germany, both the British Empire and the USSR could focus on helping with Japan, which naturally wouldn't be able to resist all three. Now, some in the US military weren't convinced and believed that Britain wasn't being proactive enough against the Germans. US General George Marshall argued that the British army hadn't performed very well up until this point, and that Britain wasn't doing enough to prepare for a major invasion of the continent, and that the British were simply expecting American soldiers to do a lot of the
I like how eyes get smaller and smaller. At the point you can barely see them.
Fighting and dying to save them. He was willing to support a Europe-first approach, providing that the Allies launched an invasion of Europe in early 1942. He was soon told to be quiet because such a plan wasn't possible, because neither Britain nor America could build up the troops or equipment quick enough to invade, let alone do it successfully. As such, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed on a sort of compromise. Instead of having American soldiers sitting in Britain waiting for 4 years, they would invade Africa. This would divert resources from Germany and also the other one, thus relieving the pressure on the USSR. Once North Africa was subdued, the Allies would then be free to attack the soft underbelly of Europe, either going through Italy or the Balkans. Also, by landing in Africa, it would act as a major deterrent to Spain to keep them out of the war, which was a nice added bonus. For those in the Destroy Japan camp, this wasn't really good enough. They believed that Germany only posed a short-term threat to American shipping, whereas if Japan was allowed to run roughshod all over the Pacific, they would gain valuable resources, would be able to entrench themselves, and could make it impossible for the Americans to counterattack by depriving them of staging areas. However, one thing working against the Japan First proponents was the previous war.
Okay, could you imagine, like, if they had attacked Japan first, subdued Japan somehow, Japan was going to fight to the last person. I don't know, that would have worked, but yeah, probably invasion of Japan. Let's think that, right? Okay, Japan is liberated. Now nuclear bombs go through and it's dropped on Munich. I don't even know like how that would have played out. Like bombs being dropped at Germany. Like how the history would have changed. Like would they have worked, or like maybe like German would have like accelerated atomic research and they're probably the first to do it. What would have happened then? Probably Wolfenstein storyline. That would have happened. We are all speaking German or something.
War plans that the US had been working on since the 1930s. These were the famous Rainbow plans, there to prepare the United States for a range of hypothetical conflicts against numerous coalitions of opponents. One such plan was Rainbow 5, which assumed that the US would fight a war against Germany, Japan and Italy whilst it was allied with Britain and France. Britain would help on the seas, and France, like the previous war, would hold the Germans off on the continent. This plan called for the US to use its navy to secure the Atlantic first, build up the army to the previous Germany-crushing levels deployed in World War I, and then, after clearing Europe, smashing Japan. And as you'll know, barring the France bit, it was pretty accurate in predicting what said conflict would look like. With that in mind, both nations agreed on a plan to stall Japanese expansion whilst Germany was dealt with. The first was that Britain, the US, Australia and the Dutch government in exile would unify their command in Southeast Asia. The plan was to create what was called the Malay Barrier. This was supposed to be an impenetrable defensive line which would stop the Japanese advance, thereby saving India and Australia as well as depriving Tokyo of the region's resources and manpower. Spoiler alert though, didn't work. There was also an agreement that Britain would increase its military commitment to East Asia, and furthermore, both nations pledged to do more to supply the Chinese to keep them in the fight and tie up Japanese resources. Roosevelt ultimately had the last say, and whilst he wanted Britain to stay in the war, he wasn't a fool. He had already secured numerous concessions from Churchill throughout 1940 and 1941, and he believed that even if Britain didn't lose the war, its days as an international superpower were over, meaning that it, along with Japan and Germany, would no longer be able to potentially threaten the US, which is another one of the reasons that he agreed to Europe first, or more accurately a Germany first approach.
Yeah, but I think that would have happened anyway. Like Europe already like killed itself in certain way. So if they had approached Europe first or like gone through Japan, that would have happened anyway.
Now, of course, you'd think that once this was agreed, the Americans would follow said plan, but fun fact, no. You see, the agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill was that the US would stall Japanese expansion. But to the leaders of the Navy, that was up to interpretation. The United States built up an incredible number of ships to take the fight to Japan and also built up much larger ground forces in the region. And in the following year, the US Navy was able to inflict numerous crushing defeats on the Japanese Navy. And the first American offensive didn't occur on the other side of the Atlantic, but at Guadalcanal. And despite the fact that the US had agreed to a Europe-first approach, the Pacific War took up most of Washington's resources until late 1943. It was only in the lead up to D-Day that the US massively increased its prioritization of Germany over Japan. Much of this was due to the fact that in Europe the Soviets were doing the majority of the fighting. And had they not been involved, then the US almost certainly would have needed to massively increase its commitments to Europe. As you'll know, the Germans...
let's not forget Soviet Union lost a shit ton of people at the level where there are more women than men even today in Russia and other Soviet countries. Yeah, that number is insanity. When we think about the numbers, how many lives were lost in World War II, the number rises to ridiculous level. World War II looks like small peanut in front of it. A lot of them are probably from Soviet Union.
Would surrender first. But before the US, Soviet Union and the British Empire were able to fully turn their attention to Japan after this, it too would unconditionally surrender, because reasons. In the end, the USA's resources, population and military know-how were so great that it had more than enough of each to destroy the Axis powers under the current conditions, whilst also supplying its allies to help them do the same. The Europe-first strategy was never about America's survival, but simply about efficiently allocating resources and making...
Yeah, it was never about survival. America wasn't even thinking about survival. America thinking how to fuck up something next.
Sure that American lives wouldn't be needlessly wasted. This meant stalling Japan before it could entrench and propping up Britain and the USSR so Germany couldn't later do the same. And in the end, conditions on the ground meant that the Europe-first strategy existed largely in name only. It placated the British by lessening the German threat to the British Isles directly. And importantly, it did nothing to stop the US Navy, Marines and Army from taking the fight to the Japanese, which the American people wanted above all else.
This is just basically an example of when you have a lot of shit, you don't have to worry about what to do first, do you? Oh, should I eat pizza or should I eat burger? I don't know, but I guess eat both.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle.
It was an 8-minute video. That was a surprise. Like this channel usually a 3-4 minute one, so this was a big one. I guess it needed a bigger time. Oh, this is from today. I thought it was 4 days ago. No, it's 4 hours ago. All right. Okay, this was a surprise to me. I didn't know that they went like that. I thought as soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked, they just went all in on Japan, like screw everything else. But no. They had proper strategy. That shit wouldn't work today. If that happened today and they're like, okay, we're going to go Europe first. Because of the internet and social media, people would lose their shit. They would have to go after Japan, regardless of what. Back then, before news reaches anyone, they're probably, things are already underway. People are like, oh, military is doing their thing. We trust military type of way. Every month or every 2 months, people try to get answers. That's it. Alright, well, that was why didn't the US focus on Japan first in World War II by channel History Matters. If you like my reason, don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you next time.